We're going to talk about quirky film here on the Overnightscape Central. And it looks like it's going to be a big one. We've got, I think there's 5 contributions in the old inbox. So, yeah, we're just going places and some people we haven't heard from in a while. This is going to be good. And stalwarts. And of course, Frank Edward Nora is here. So just buckle up your seatbelt. You looked, you know how long this file's going to be. Get some snacks and beverages and whatever else you might need for enhancement purposes. And we're just going to get this ball rolling straight up, straight out of the box. And we're going to hear from Mike in Green Bay because we're talking about quirky film.
Hello, PQ, and all the Overnightscape listeners that are today, Saturday, March 13th, 2021. It's Mike from Green Bay, Wisconsin. Current temperature is 49 degrees here. The low was about 19 degrees when I got up this morning at 5:45. And while I was monitoring the temperature throughout the day, I saw that it hit 54, so I'm going to say that was probably our high. Today's subject, quirky film. This is one of my favorite topics, quirky film. You know, quirky, if you want to define quirky or quirky film, that's largely opinion. You can look up, on IMDb, quirky films, and they have, of course, a whole list, some of which you may think are quirky, others maybe are not so quirky. There's a few on there that I found to be films that I agree are quirky, but there are other films I think are quirky that they don't list at all. And that's really all in the eye of the beholder. Movies in general, for me, a good movie starts with a good original story. Now, I generally don't like remade film, remakes. They're usually never as good as the original, especially if the original had a good story. I mean, how do you improve a good story? If you add something to it, probably not good anymore. Sure, you can spice up the film with special effects or, colorizing or, a lot of different sound effects or whatever. But really, when it comes right down to it, the originality of the original film, to me, tops any kind of improvement they would make. And of course, there's always the cinematography, the sound, any music that's in the film. There are a few memorable films where I recall they use recorded music just at the right time. The song was very fitting. Or in some cases, a group of people would break out in song, singing something that was appropriate for the moment. But generally, music is not my thing. It can add to the film, but I'm not big into musicals or anything like that. Sound effects can add to a film too. But the thing is, I think nowadays they rely too much on sound effects and special effects in movies. And when it comes right down to it, a lot of these new films, they just simply don't have a good story. And they're fun to watch, maybe the first time. But once you've seen the special effects and the sound effects, you're kind of done with it after that. Really good movies, you can watch over and over and over. Maybe pick something out different every time you watch it. Or just appreciate what you know is coming. A lot of times That's my favorite thing. I'm a big Bogart fan, and I like movies that Bogart did because they were he was a great actor, and just watching him do his craft was reward enough for me. Um, it also helps that the movie's a good story, but special effects, sound effects, virtually none in his movies. You were working with almost always good acting and a good story. Now, I think that to be a quirky film and to be a good quirky film, one that you'd want to watch again, you have to have at least one oddball character in there. Something that is really out of the ordinary. I mean, that you wouldn't really ever see in your lifetime, maybe. Or some other situation that's just out of this world. I made a top 10 list of quirky films that I like. And, I mean, everybody's got their own favorites. But these are films that I consider quirky that have kind of a different take on the story or character. Number 10, The Brain That Wouldn't Die from 1962. The director was Joseph Greeley. Really no notable stars in that movie. But it was kind of, I consider it quirky because it had this notion that you could actually cut off someone's head and keep their brain alive by pumping fluid through it from a little pan. They had a little setup in there where they had the brain on a table and it was being held in place by some pins, and it was a woman's head. And she couldn't talk, she could mouth things, the brain, the head, as it were. And she was somehow able to communicate with some kind of monster they had behind the door in that film, as I recall. Through brain waves or something. So that was a kind of a unique thing. Not, it's not an Academy Award winner, but notable in my mind as quirky. Number 9, Dr. Strangelove, 1964. A Stanley Kubrick film, directed by Stanley Kubrick. Brilliant mind for directing. I think maybe kind of went off the rails sometimes on some of his later stuff. But really good. And Dr. Strangelove, it's a Cold War classic. And stars Slim Pickens, George C. Scott, James Earl Jones, who I think that had to be one of his first parts in a film, maybe. He played the, I think either the navigator or bombardier on a plane carrying an atomic bomb. And of course, Peter Sellers, who had 3 parts in the movie. He played a English lieutenant who was training at an American air base. He also played Dr. Strangelove himself, and he played the President of the United States. So, brilliant actor, Peter Sellers. Was really good in this film, although I never really cared for a lot of the parts that he had in other movies, his characters. That whole Pink Panther thing just wasn't for me, and he spent a lot of time on that. Number 8, Night of the Living Dead, 1968. To me, this was one of the first of the zombie movies. It has a ironic ending, as it were. Number 7, The Station Agent, 2003, directed by Tom McCarthy. And if you are like me and kind of a train buff, you'll like this movie because there's a lot of kind of not off-putting, but train. If you're a train enthusiast, there's a lot of things in here that you'll find interesting. But it's not really about trains. It's about a guy that inherited an old train station. And Peter Dinklage is in here. And also Patricia Clarkson, a very underrated actor in my opinion. Patricia Clarkson plays many different roles in film, not typecast at all. I find her to be a really good actor. Number 6, Office Space, 1999. Kind of a odd film in that if you've ever been around or worked in an office, you can relate to some things in here. There's a kind of a quick get-rich-quick scene in here, or scheme rather, that these guys participate in and they get into trouble. It's directed by Mike Judge. Ron Livingston and Jennifer Aniston are in that film. Number 5, UHF, 1989. Directed by Jay Levy. Stars Weird Al Yankovic, Victoria Jackson, and Michael Richards. And this is a comedy film, but it's quirky in that they make a beloved character out of a janitor. And the janitor is a quirky character. I don't want to say too much about any of these films because I don't want to spoil it if anybody wants to watch these. I'm not going to give away anything too much here.
Oh, you're doing fine. You're just right. In fact, your consideration in that realm is appreciated. There's no point in giving away the whole game. Just entice the taste buds, like I think you have there with one of those. Station Agent has been marked on my keep one eye out list. I don't think I've even heard of that one, but weird train stuff. From Super Train on back is always amusing, especially if somebody recommends it. Any brain movie, it is somehow, it's already going to be fun. Like the one with the floating brain, inflatable, glowing brains, and all that stuff. Any brain movie, it's going to be solid gold at some point, even if it drags here and there. That it's a brain movie. Dr. Strangelove. I will not elaborate except to say that movie is simply almost too good. That's just a delicious bit of filmmaking, and for the most part, I am a great admirer of the Kubrick Meister. UHF that's another incredible one. Michael Richards was born to play that role. I'm not the hugest Seinfeld fan in the world, but Michael Richards in UHF, you got to see if you haven't.
Number 4, From Dusk Till Dawn. Directed by Quentin Tarantino. Stars George Clooney. Tarantino is also in it, and Harvey Keitel. Harvey Keitel also, I think, a kind of an underrated actor. I find him to be very entertaining, very good at what he does. But the upshot of that film is, all the time you're watching the beginning of that film, you're thinking that film is going somewhere other than it actually does. That's all I want to say about that. right in the middle of that film, it changes gears drastically to something you're not going to expect. Number 3, Pulp Fiction, also a Quentin Tarantino film. And Tarantino, you could almost list all of his films as quirky, because I think he's a quirky guy. But his style and presentation, especially in this film, it's all out of sequence. And you don't kind of really put that together until when the first time you see it, until you're kind of halfway through maybe or more. And he's not in this film himself, but it's trademark Tarantino. It's packed with stars, though, in this film. John Travolta, Bruce Willis, Samuel L. Jackson, Harvey Keitel again. Apparently, Tarantino likes Keitel. So I think he was also in Reservoir Dogs, which was also a Tarantino film. Not on my list, though. Number 2, Lars and the Real Girl from 2007. Stars directed by Craig Gillespie. Stars Ryan Gosling and Patricia Clarkson. This is another film that starts out kind of ho-hum and changes gears in the middle. Not as dramatically as From Dusk Till Dawn, but gives you something to work on. And once again, a terrific performance by Patricia Clarkson in here. And my number one pick as a quirky film, Napoleon Dynamite from 2004. Directed by Jared Hess, and of course starred John Heder. And I have a whole list of trivia from this film, if you're interested. John Heder drew all the drawings for the movie. If you remember all his drawings, he actually drew those, except for the unicorn. For Napoleon's dance routine, director Jared Hess had John Heder improvise and dance to 3 different songs. Hess then took the best moves from each song and put them in 1 minute in a one routine using one song. So, dance to 3 different songs, but you only heard one song. Heder was paid $1,000 to play Napoleon Dynamite. The movie grossed $40 million in the United States. It was shot in 22 days, and it featured one of the longest credited cast lists in movie history. If you recall the students in the film, they all got their names on the closing credits, 181 of them. The scene of the farmer shooting the cow in front of the school bus full of children is actually a true anecdote from director Jared Hess's childhood. Wow. In real life, the llama's name is Dolly, not Tina. She belongs to the director and co-writer Jared Hess's mother. I have to say, I worked for a few years at the county zoo. I was stationed there, and they had llamas, and I always used that, "Tina, eat the food," that line every day. The zookeepers loved it. John Heder, Napoleon, and Efren Ramirez, Pedro, who play lead characters in the movie, each have an identical twin in real life. Uncle Rico's girlfriend, who rides up to him on her bicycle at the end of the film, is Aaron Ruel's wife in real life, and Aaron Ruel is Kip. Despite playing high school students, John Heder and Efren Ramirez were respectively 26 and 31 when the movie was made. Again, with the dance scene, John Heder's big dance scene at the end was the last scene scheduled to be filmed, but the film ran out during shooting. The sequences were edited together with less than 10 minutes of his dancing. Every dish shown on the opening credits is eaten by a character later in the movie. Aaron Ruel had braces put on his teeth for this role. 2 orthodontists were thanked in the credits. John Heder credited Tina Majorino, or Deb, from the movie, with helping to choreograph the dance scene. He also states that some of the dance moves were borrowed from Michael Jackson, the Backstreet Boys, John Travolta, and Soul Train, as well as some of their moves. Whenever Deb is in the cafeteria, she's eating a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. In real life, Tina Majorino, who plays Deb, has a life-threatening allergy to peanuts. The movie was edited, for you tech guys, you'll like this. The movie was edited in producer Jeremy Coon's apartment using a $6,000 Macintosh with Final Cut Pro, which is Apple's film editing software. John Heder permed his hair for the film. The opening title sequence was partially reshot due to some of the executives at Fox Searchlight not liking the look of the actors' hands who placed the food into the shot. They flew out a hand model to reshoot some of the shoots with the director. John Heder helped make the boondoggle keychains between scenes. John Grease, or Uncle Rico as he's known in the film, was actually not a vegetarian despite the claims. But whenever he was wiping his mouth, he was actually spitting out the steak because he just does not eat red meat in real life. The film is based on a short film Jared Hess made in 2002 with John Heder. Almost everything from the short made it into the feature film. For instance, there's a scene in the feature film where Napoleon and Pedro are at a state fair appraising cows or tasting milk. In the shoot, there's only one line of spoken dialogue that mentions the taste testing of the milk. The Ligor is a real animal created when a male lion mates with a female tiger. Let's see, page 2. The scene where Uncle Rico hits Napoleon in the face takes 4 takes. Jack Black almost played Rex. Remember Rex Kwon-Do? He would later star in director Jared Hess's next film, Nacho Libre. And Nacho Libre, that kind of brings back a memory. I traded my copy of Dr. Strangelove to someone at work for what they considered their quirky film, which was Nacho Libre. I gave her back Nacho Libre with my sad appraisal of it, but she never gave back my Dr. Strangelove, so I'm without Dr. Strangelove. Napoleon's student ID shown in the opening credits clearly established that the film takes place in 2004. However, fashion, technology, and pop culture are all from the 80s and 90s. Jared Hess was once asked when the movie takes place, and his response was simply, Idaho. Having the food plates spell out names in the opening credits was actor Aaron Ruel Kip's idea. The rest of the sequence was designed and executed by Pablo Ferro. There's a little something here about the production staff. John Heder, Aaron Ruel, Jared Hess, and most of the production staff are all Mormons. Plus the town of Preston is over 90% Mormon. Nor does the movie have any foul language, alcohol, or sexual jokes. Despite all this, there is not a single reference to Mormonism in the entire movie. Nor is there any explanation as to what happened to Kip and Napoleon's parents. And the t-shirt Grandma is wearing strongly implies that she's been divorced. Little tidbit here about John Grease, who played the uncle in the movie. John Grease nearly quit acting, planning on dedicating himself to writing when a casting director he knew needed him to play a role that another actor dropped out of in The Big Empty, 2003. Grease filmed the role, and when his scenes were being edited together, filmmakers Jared Hess and Jeremy Coons were casting for Napoleon Dynamite. In the same office, they were casting for Napoleon Dynamite in the same office and got a look at Greaves' work, prompting them to offer him the role of Uncle Rico. Greaves said that his manager was unsure of the role as the filmmakers were not known, but Greaves read the script anyway and said by page 15 he was happy to play the role. 2 houses were used for the filming of Napoleon's house, one for outdoor shots, one for indoor. Behind the scenes at the 2004 Sundance Film Festival, Fox Searchlight engaged in a bidding war with Warner Independent Pictures over the distribution rights of the movie, until Fox Searchlight put in a last-minute bid for over $3 million and won. They would later join forces with Paramount Pictures and MTV Films to distribute the film a mere 17 days before its release. A whole lot of stuff I'm skipping over here. If you think this is too long already, there's like twice as much I could be reading here. Tina Majorino had a life-threatening peanut allergy. When Deb is eating, well, we talked about this, jelly sandwich. Napoleon's Dance is to Canned Heat by Jamiroquai. The scene after the credits where Napoleon rides up on a horse is inspired by the Australian classic film The Man from Snowy River. Even the music for this sequence is a direct reference to the film's score by Bruce Rowland. Although the title design genius Pablo Ferro, Dr. Strangelove, is credited for the design, the front title sequence with plates of food and hand-piped titling was the work of Aaron Ruel, who played Kip, Napoleon's brother. Pablo Ferrar wrote Napoleon Dynamite directly onto the desk at the start of the movie, according to Aaron Ruel's commentary on Blu-ray, implying that Ferro did not come up with the plates of food idea. At 27 minutes and 13 seconds in the movie, you can hear the sound of the steak hitting Napoleon before it actually makes contact with his face. Due to the film's surprise success at festivals and its limited release, Fox Searchlight re-edited the film to add a 5-minute epilogue at the end. This epilogue, which was filmed after the initial theatrical run, features a surprise wedding scene that cost about half of what the entire feature cost to make. John Heder and Dietrich Bader later starred in Surf's Up 2007 and Surf's Up 2 Wave Mania in 2017. So, there are the trivia notes for Napoleon Dynamite. And I'm at about 26 minutes here, so I think I've said my piece about film, quirky film here, and I'm going to give it back to you, PQ.
Ah, well put. A good list there. Napoleon Dynamite, I just never quite understood how whoever wrote it and produced it and released it, never once anybody mentioned that Elvis Costello had put out an album under the name Napoleon Dynamite not that many years before the movie was made. I mean, I'm sure it was all settled legally in the end, but it just completely confused me. But, well, just like there was a movie Disney made called Shark Boy a few years ago, which I've only seen bits of, and it's quirky, but it probably isn't worth seeing. The interesting thing about Shark Boy is like the other one here, nobody checked. There was a professional wrestler who worked in several different promotions over the years, named Shark Boy, who had the cute little costume with the fin and the face mask. And I do know that he got an undisclosed settlement from the Disney company that made his days far more comfortable, to say the least. What else have we got here? Dusk Till Dawn. I love Tarantino, And maybe it was just when I saw it or how it was presented to me, but Dusk Till Dawn just made me angry. I mean, really, I was like, what am I watching at a certain point? And I don't think I've ever seen the last, half hour or so of Dusk Till Dawn. I really should go back and just finish it or something. I did, and don't let me deter you from watching it because that might be exactly what you like, my tastes, and what I mean. I just had this conversation with Coptic Nerve about film, and we differ completely. For example, on the movie Boogie Nights. He thinks it's just this incredible piece of filmmaking. And to me, I realized about, a little better than halfway through the movie that I didn't like any of the characters in the movie at all. I didn't identify with any of them. And it just got more. And then the movie's pacing slows down, or at least that's what I remember, considerably as it goes on. And it was torturous watching the last parts of that film without spoiling any material once again. Because I guess the Boogie Nights had some quirks. That could be a quirky movie. You never know. And that movie Lars may also merit further tracking. It's been written down on the list. Anyways, and well, at least so far, nobody's meant. Well, those early 30s, late 20s had some weird, quirky, great comedy stuff. That it's just all the Marx Brothers movies, anything with W.C. Fields that's a talkie is worth at least watching the scenes he is in, if not all of it. Well, did you want to talk about quirky? Good boy. Crispin Glover. We discussed briefly Little Noises on the exit ramp recently, which the plot is Crispin Glover plays this would-be writer who steals this other sort of handicapped kid's writing and publishes it and gets famous, but he published it under his own name and all that was, and anything. Crispin Glover, just he's got a taste for playing weirdos, and he does it quite well. And yeah, we can all drivel about this a lot, but we got a lot to get to. So I'm going to hush my mouth for the moment, and we're going to hand the floor over to an expert in quirky film, a genius of the field, our very own Doc Sleaze.
Films can seem quirky for a variety of reasons. The director's particular choice of shooting style, their narrative structure, eccentric performances by actors. Often it's because, this is where you'll find a lot of so-called quirky films, because of, you find it in the low budget sector of filmmaking, because often the script may have started off with the intent of having a bigger budget, and includes scenes and has lavish plot points which would require more money than was actually available. So they have to find ways round that, which often ends up with inventive shooting of the film, like things having to happen off stage, off screen, rather than on screen, only be referred back to. It can seem very quirky and confusing to suddenly be told that I don't know, various characters have been killed off. You thought they were important, but suddenly they killed off screen. You thought, what the hell's that about? And also at the low budget end, of course, there's more often than not just low budget films. You find it with big budget films, post production problems when a film ends up severely edited in post-production. Often it's taken out of the original director's hands. Sometimes scenes are reshot, so you've got a stylistic clash, often because they brought in a director with a different style. Um, all sorts of things make them seem quirky. Often, with low-budget films, what will happen is sometimes a project won't be completed. They run out of money, basically, before completion. And the footage is bought by somebody else. And they shoot, as I said, they shoot new footage for it. Sometimes this can happen years later. And sometimes they manage to get some of the cast back to do the reshoots. Other times they bring in new actors and have to work around the existing footage. So you have major characters who are never in shot together, who never meet in the narrative, which again makes it seem very odd and quirky. Sometimes that involves changing the plot of the film entirely. Now, an example of that would be a film, again, I've talked about it on my own podcast. Evil Town is one of the most notorious examples of that. Had a torturous production history. It started off in the early 70s as a low-key horror film directed by Curtis Hanson, I believe, who later went on to Curtis Hanson, rather, who went on to bigger and better things. But it was never completed, never quite completed. And years later, it was bought by another. Well, nobody's quite sure what happened. At some point, somebody shot more footage for it with some of the original cast and an entire new cast and started restructuring the film. And then another notorious low-budget director came in and shot yet more footage. And the whole plot of the film was changed. Characters just vanished partway through. There are characters, as I say, they appear to interact, they don't, because they're never actually in the same shot together, but clearly they've been shot on the same set. It's notorious for Dean Jagger, the veteran character actor Dean Jagger, Oscar winner, in fact, best supporting actor for, was it 12 O'Clock High, was it? It gives the most contemptuous performance. I mean, it's quite bizarre, his performance. This is Mad Doctor, and it completely undermines the film as if it wasn't already undermined by the strange re-editing of it. I won't go into detail. I've spoken about it elsewhere before, but there's an example. The end result is actually horrendous and frustrating because you can't feel what's left of the original footage. There was a decent little, say, low-key thriller there originally. If only they just managed to complete it. It would have become a minor classic, probably. But anyway, quirkiness can often come from, of course, foreign language films dubbed into English. For two reasons they appear quirky. Partly because the approach to film in the non-English speaking world can be quite different to ours. You go to Italy, for instance, and the emphasis is very much on the look of the film. Narrative plays second fiddle to it. It doesn't seem important to either Italian producers, directors, or even audiences that the narrative necessarily make entire linear sense. What they look for is the look of the film, the feel of the film, the atmosphere. In terms of exploitation films, the more gory, the more out there it is, the more they like it. French films often appear odd to us in the English-speaking world because they don't like to have the leading characters don't have such a clear moral compass as traditionally they do in the English-speaking world of cinema. They're basically, more often than not, amoral. They're quite happy and quite unrepentant at doing bad things in order to achieve what is supposedly a good, the right conclusion in the end. even more so. I mean, okay, I mean, films in like Hollywood films like Dirty Harry sort of started to muddy the moral line, but French films have always gone much further than that. But the other reason they seem odd and quirky to us, not just because they might have the way characters are presented or the way their narratives seem odd to us, but because in the process of being dubbed into English, they usually also suffer a degree of re-editing, which often makes them seem even more bizarre. But to stop talking of generalities and to look at more specifics, if you want quirky directors, the Spanish director, the late Jesus Franco, Jess Franco, is the king of quirky directors. A man who made God knows how many 100 films, and I'm not exaggerating there. He just used to turn up. He was actually an interesting thing. He was a jazz. I was discussing this actually on the exit ramp with Mark Rose from Fusebox. He started out as a jazz musician, in fact, before he was ever a film director. And Harry Alan Towers, another a very quirky British producer who produced several of Franco's films, always remarked that probably explained Franco's directorial style. In that basically, it was all, it was improvised. It always seems more than slightly improvised the way he put scenes together and shot them. He was also notorious, Franco, for the use of the zoom lens. You have lots of, for no reason at all, zooms all of a sudden in on characters situations. Now, not surprisingly, but I mean, Franco originally, he made all films in all genres. He's best remembered for his horror films. But later in his career, he moved into, because they were cheaper to make, and he used to make more sort of erotic material. But it was all equally bizarre. His films often exist in multiple versions. They've been re-edited sometimes by him, with new scenes, shot scenes instead of sometimes by the producers. It's quite bewildering. The Sadist of Notre Dame exists in at least 3 different versions. One of them a hardcore sex version. Disconcertingly, he plays the title character. Franco himself plays the title character, some kind of furtive, perverted murderer of women who writes erotic stories about the murder of women. However, lest anyone think he was typecasting himself, I've seen and I've read interviews with Franco, and in real life he's actually a very nice man, actually, very intellectual, very, very, very likable, and he did like the ladies though. Often his leading ladies would often end up becoming like muses to him, and he'd end up marrying them. Not all at once, obviously. Remember, the beautiful Soledad Miranda was either married to him as partner for many years. But as I say, his films, it's beguiling the breadth of his output, and at their worst, they're quite sloppily put. He was clearly, films he made on a budget and to a schedule, and they could be quite sloppily put together. Some of them have bored me to tears, I must admit. But amongst all of the schlock, which have English language titles like "Kiss Me Monster," or was it the 2 Girl Spies in Flowered Panties? I kid you not, that's more or less the title of one of his films. Amongst them are some genuinely good minor classics, real cult or at least they should be cult classics. His version of Venus and Furs, which in truth has very little to do with the infamous novel, by what's his name, Massock, wasn't it, the man who gave us the term masochism. It hasn't have a great deal to do with that, but it is such a fantastic atmospheric, basically ghost story, which all moves to a bizarre ending, which either explains everything or explains nothing at all, depending upon how you look at it. But it really is a fascinating film. It's partly shot in Turkey and partly shot in Brazil at the same time as he was shooting another film. He's shooting a Fu Manchu film, or films, for Harry Allen Towers, who also produced Venus and Furs at the same time in those locations. And so, yeah, this is another thing that Franco did. He'd shoot films simultaneously, about the same, sometimes sharing cast members and everything. And Venus and Furs is a very, very good film, very enjoyable. There's another one, Rio 70, shot in Brazil, probably at the same time as well as he was doing a Fu Manchu film, and Venus and Furs. It's another good one. It's allegedly loosely based on the Sax Roma character, this female villain. Again, it's a really great sub-Bondian adventure story, comic strip style story, really well shot, really well put together, with an excellent cast. It's films like that you think are amazing. He often there are lots of familiar faces turn up in his films. Klaus Kinski used to appear in a lot of them, and he once told the story of how Jess Franco had deceived him into appearing in one of them. He told Franco he had no wish to be in another Dracula film or vampire film, whatever it was. At this point, he'd done too many, and he found himself making this film with Jess Franco, just shooting these scenes. And Franco said, "Well, don't worry about the film. We'll do it later." And he said, there came a point where I ended up saying to to the director, "Why do I feel that I'm in a Dracula movie?" And of course, it turned out he actually was. Franco was shooting a Dracula movie. He hadn't told. He hadn't told Klaus Kinski that's what these scenes were destined to be put into, because he knew he would have refused to do them. That was a film called Count Dracula, which is notable for having Christopher Lee as Dracula in it. About the only time he played Dracula outside of the Hammer film series. And he did it because he was assured it would be more faithful to the original novel than the Hammer versions, or in any other version be made up to then. It wasn't. I mean, the main claim to authenticity is Dracula has a moustache and gets younger throughout the film. And unfortunately, it was shot virtually entirely in and around Madrid, pretending to be London. In some things which looks more than London and Transylvania and God knows where else, and all the time looking like Spain. He also made a pair of, back in the 70s, Franco made a pair of Frankenstein films. The slightly more conventional one was Dracula, Prisoner of Frankenstein, which comes over very much like one of those Universal monster rallies from the 40s, and has Dennis Price as Frankenstein, and I can't remember who was Dracula. Dracula was another well-known continental actor. It's a very bizarre film. It really is. There are times when it borders on the surreal. It was once described by a film writer once who told us how he woke up once. He'd fallen asleep on the sofa and woke up to find, in the middle of the night, to find this film playing on the television. And he said it's like having an out-of-body experience trying to figure out what the hell is this? What is going on? As you can tell from the title, basically it involves Frankenstein kidnapping Dracula for some reason. I think it's to exact revenge on his enemies or something, and then the monster wanders around and kidnaps someone from a disco humming brightly, and it's it's all quite bizarre. Anyway, he made another one back to back, virtually back to back with it. Involved many of the same actors. Has various titles, but it's often, I have it on DVD under the title of The Erotic Experiences of Frankenstein. Dennis Price reprises his role as Frankenstein, but is killed off in the first few minutes of the film. So in fact, he doesn't have any erotic experiences. The erotic experiences are those of his monster, which in this film, the previous one had looked pretty much like the Universal Studios monster. And this one is this big silver man who is subjected to all sorts of he's kidnapped by a rival mad scientist come sorcerer, Cagliostro, and who carries out all sorts of bizarre experiments, and all involves lots of whips and sadomasochism. And there are some utterly bizarre and kinky scenes in it. I mean, this is quirky, shall we say, filmmaking taken to the extreme. Again, it is utterly, utterly bizarre. And you could imagine any other director coming up with this. Whether it's any good is another question. Whether it has artistic merit, I don't know. But I do believe that in Dracula, Prisoner of Frankenstein, two films, if you showed them to someone and you didn't tell them that Jess Franco had directed them, might well feel these are lost surrealist classics. They really are utterly, utterly bizarre. But there you go. But when talking of quirky filmmaking, one perhaps has to mention he actually died last week, a British director called Norman J. Warren. Not a household name. But during the 70s, he was one of those British filmmakers who, whilst the British film industry was collapsing around them, succeeded in scraping together the finance to make a number of independent exploitation films, which are actually of surprisingly good quality, that are obviously made on tiny budgets. Usually shot over a period of months through necessity, so to shoot at weekends, shoot around the schedules of the actors who are often doing other things. Yet he put them together, and they were actually pretty good, some of them. And he started off, like many British directors did, to get directorial credits directing sex films, but ended up doing these exploitation films. And he's just about the nicest man. I've seen him interviewed and read interviews, and he had to be just about the nicest man to ever have worked in exploitation filmmaking. He admitted he never went into this with the intention of being an exploitation film director, but it was the only way he was going to get to make his own films. And so he wholeheartedly embraced the world of exploitation. And he ranged from sort of gothic-type horror films like Satan's Slave, which actually isn't a bad little film. It's got Michael Gough in it, the late great Michael Gough, who appeared in many British horror films. In fact, would do anything for money in filmmaking terms. He's a fine actor, but he saw himself primarily as a stage actor, and film and television work was just for money. And he appeared and gave some truly bizarre performances in British movies over the years, British horror movies over the years. He has an alarming set of facial hair in it, as I remember, and a rather alarmingly checked suit he wears. But And it also co-stars Candace Glendenning, a British actress who, for a while, young British actress, looked like she was going places, but ended up doing exploitation films. And it's not a bad little film. It's basically the usual tale of sort of middle-class suburban Satanism in Britain, but quite nicely done. There was that. He did a couple of science fiction films. Prey, which is very good, and also made in a very low budget with a small cast, but that's very, very good. Only runs about 80 minutes, and it's again set in sort of ordinary middle class Britain, involving an alien predator who comes to Earth in human guise and stalks these Earth women as prey. But I say stalk, it's not like in the manner of the Predator in the Arnold Schwarzenegger films. It's, he appears most of the time quite normal. It's his behaviour sometimes and his inability to understand human emotion and so on, which gives him away. And it was a very neat little film, very enjoyable. And there's that. He actually got a bigger budget science fiction film that was proved very successful at the box office and subsequently on video and DVD, which is Inseminoid, also sometimes known as Horror Planet, which actually had a bit more money behind it because the Shaw brothers from Hong Kong backed that one. They put up the money for that one. And it's actually, you can see it's got a bigger budget than usual. It's got a better known cast than usual. I can't say it's one of my favourite Norman J. Warren films. I often find that with low-budget film directors, they're never at the best when they're given money. Because when the lack of finance on the lower-budget films forces them to be more ingenious in the way they make films and tell stories. He also made a British sex comedy, Spaced Out, or sometimes known as Out of Touch, which it's really like a sex comedy version of Close Encounters, probably, with female aliens, spaceship breaks down and has to briefly land on Earth, where they end up. Of course, they have no concept of men, which leaves them wondering how they reproduce, but won't go anyway. So inevitably, some Earth people end up kidnapped on their ship, and all sorts of hilarious sexual. Actually, Johnny Jinks it's actually a surprisingly entertaining film. A typical British sex comedy, clearly made on an absolutely tiny budget, but it's all in good fun. It's very amiable, very likeable. But most intriguing amongst Warren's films was from 78? Terror. Terror was inspired by his having seen Dario Argento's supernatural giallo, which was remade recently, Suspiria. And whilst it doesn't imitate in plot terms particularly an Argento film, it is a fascinating, very low budget British attempt to produce something along the lines of a supernatural giallo. And as such, he manages to hit the sort of slightly disjointed storytelling you find in Italian films. And it's the idea that you get from Argento, the key to Argento films, and this is his best films, the ones he made in the 70s mainly, is that the eye does deceive. You cannot believe what you see, is the key to Argento. And he rather does, and Warren does this in Terror, especially in the opening, where we have a witch burning going on, people being cursed and some horrible murders, and then it all pulls back to reveal. Then suddenly credits roll. We reveal this is a film being screened, which is a horror film which is supposedly based on real events several hundred years before, and the director is a descendant of the person who had the witch burned at the stake, and then what then unfolds is a story about the curse enacting itself, this witch's curse enacting itself upon the family. Where it becomes slightly odd and confusing is a lot of the targets of the bizarre murders are in fact not, they're associates but not directly related to the family she's meant to be persecuting, but there you go. But it does have some really good scenes in it. There's a nice one at the film studio. We're in the midst of where a typical British sex comedy is being shot. It's very realistically done. This poor girl in a bath. She's been showing this sexy bath time. She's perpetually complaining the bath water ran cold several takes ago. She's freezing to death in there. There's nothing sexy about it. It's all erotic about this at all. And it has various sort of bizarre murders. A film producer finds himself strangled to death by some celluloid film which comes to life, for instance, amongst other things. It is an interesting little film. Worth a look. Well worth a look. Very quirky in terms of I've never seen any other British director come that close to catching the style and feel of a classic Italian giallo movie as Terror did. But yeah. But US low-budget filmmaking has its fair share of what one might describe as quirky directors. I mean, the obvious bad film aficionados will always go on about Ed Wood. And Ed Wood, God bless him, was a man who loved making films and the idea of being a filmmaker, but had no discernible talent for it. Certainly not as a director. And worked with no budgets at all, which actually make his films quite charming in their way. But there are other directors I always think, it's no good obsessing over poor old Ed Wood. I mean, trust me, if you're a real hardcore fan, and you truly are a fan of bad movies, you must watch the films of Andy Milligan. Andy Milligan, who made lots of films in and around Staten Island. Although, for a few years in the late 60s, early 70s, he came to the UK and shot several films here on location in the UK. Shot them in the graveyards of England, as the publicity used to say. He specialised in gothic horror films, Andy Milligan. Now, I have to say, actually, having seen a few of his films, they're never quite as bad as you think they're going to be. They are, however, pretty bad. They were usually historical and gothic horrors, and they had very elaborate costumes, which he made himself. That was one of his things. He made these costumes. They're full of lots of stilted dialogue, scenes that go on too long. He clearly didn't know how to end a scene. Bizarre camera movements, and at best semi-professional casts. At tiny budgets, usually shot on location in a house somewhere, as I say, in the graveyards of England. The key to understanding Andy Milligan, apparently, is one, his background was in theatre. He actually ran, at the time of his death, he was running like a community theatre. And that obviously explains the sort of static scenes, dialogue-heavy scenes, the fascination with costumes, of course, because that's a big aspect of theatre dramatics, and the use often of semi-professional actors who are the kind of people he would have had access to through his theatre work. The other thing was apparently he had severe mother issues. He had a very, very bad relationship with his mother. Apparently chased with a pair of scissors, probably dressmaking scissors, presumably. And she apparently was violent towards him. But anyway, and you see that in the films often. Maternal figures are portrayed as being evil. Anyway, his films often involve werewolves, vampires, curses, all the usual stuff. The Body Beneath is one of his best known. It's in the public domain. And it pops up all over the place. It's a bit of a slog. It's one of the ones shot in the UK. So actually, the locations he uses are excellent. But oh god, it's hard work watching. It's nowhere near as bad as you might think it would be. So a lot of the production values look quite good on it for a low budget film. He's chosen his locations well. His costumes are excellent. It's just the dialogue's awful and the plotting. It just never seems to get anywhere. And some of the cast are used mainly local cast in London, and some of them actually went on, if not to fame, to forge perfectly reasonable careers as character actors, mainly on British television. But yeah, he did later, in the 80s, come back into filmmaking after a hiatus and made some films which they were still exploitation films, but they're aimed at being more commercial, of which the best known, again, because it's in the public domain, is Carnage, which is really attempts to cash in on the Amityville thing, a story of a haunted house, but it's so ineptly done, poorly plotted. And it's just like, at times, like a series of unconnected scenes, and, somebody gets electrocuted in the bath, but the question you're left asking is, why is, at the point he's electrocuted, why does there appear to be no water in the bath? Why is he wearing swimming trunks while taking a bath in a house? Something I've never done. I don't know anyone else who has, but there you are. Maybe in the world of Andy Milligan, people regularly took a bath wearing a swimsuit. Who knows? And he'd obviously got over his mother issues a bit by then, because the maternal figure maternal figures in this one are portrayed quite sympathetically. But it's just inept, all the scenes of meat cleavers and axes flying through the air and embedding themselves in people. It's so inept, and things happen and never referred to. And most horrendous things happen in this house, and nobody refers to them ever again. There's a scene where they have a priest come to exorcise the house, and he's asking about all the strange, anything strange, so and they start telling him about sort of stuff moving around and whatever, and seeing the odd apparition, and you're screaming at them. What about that freaking decapitation that happened on the bloody porch and only the previous scene? You don't mention that. I mean, I might mention that if somebody was asking me whether anything bizarre had happened in my house. And in fact, this decapitation is never mentioned again. And the poor old priest, quickly finds bits of cutlery being thrown at him as he tries to escape the house. It's a very odd film. Again, a bit of a slog to sit through. But as I say, when it comes to quirky filmmaking, if you're into that, you really need to watch at least one Andy Milligan film. And trust me, quite a lot of them turn up these days on streaming services, especially free streaming. There's quite a few of them on YouTube. They're not as bad as they could be. And there's a lot of people say they are, but they're not good. But yes, it's, But if we're going to talk quirky films again from around the world, quirky films and film directors, we must mention Jean Rollin from France with his... Well, he's famous for his vampire films, and they are mainly made throughout the 70s and into the 80s. These are strange, dreamlike films, of the strange, dreamlike feel, often involving female vampires or young girls. Often, it's a very French thing, trust me, of leading ladies who look very young. But they're strange. They're nothing like normal gothic vampire films. They're structured like dreams and play out like dreams. Often they're given misleading titles in their English language versions. Caged Virgins, which isn't an entirely inaccurate title. The two lead female characters are virgins, and that's a plot point. And they are held captive by a vampire, by this cult of vampires. But there you see, it also explores issues of morality and innocence, hence the reason why he has in the leads often these young, very innocent-looking girls. Because the point is these vampires, it's set in the present day, well, 1970s. The vampires, of course, don't live, they live almost like in a parallel reality. They live in a castle, a chateau, which no one else locally seems to be aware of exists out of normal time. And so they're judging people by older standards, different standards. They have a different conception of the world. And the plot is that the chief vampire there is the last of his kind, and he needs the blood of virgins to carry on. And not only does he need their blood, but also he needs them to be virgins to be able to convert them into vampires. But of course, he and his fellow vampires, they equate their virginity with the idea of innocence. And whilst they're virgins because they're untouched by man, they're of course lesbians. And as we, the audience, also know, they're a pair of gun-toting bad girls. They're actually on the run after a robbery, a violent robbery. It starts with a car chase, with shots being exchanged between them and another car, and their accomplice who's driving their car being shot dead, and the car crash, and they have to escape. And it's it actually starts off as if it's some kind of crime film, and then suddenly turns into this vampire film. But it is very strange, very dreamlike, very, very odd, and it explores all these ideas of innocence and so on. Another one of his vampire films was actually his last. It's called the Vampire Orphan Girls or something like that. I have it on DVD somewhere. And that is a very strange film about these two orphan girls living in this orphanage run by nuns, who now either they are in fact vampires who have been constantly reincarnated over the years, as they believe, over the centuries, or this is all a fantasy in order by them to build some kind of past and identity for themselves, because we don't even know that they really are sisters, but they have no memory of family or anything. And so one reading is they create this fantasy world, and then ultimately, to sustain their fantasy, are forced to enact various vampire-like attacks and killings of people in order to sustain their fantasy. But you are left questioning this point at the end of, were they really vampires, or was it just a fantasy from two lonely young girls? Were all these other supernatural creatures they supposedly encountered simply ordinary, prostitutes and down-and-outs and vagrants who they imagined to be super? They drew them into their fantasy world which they created. It's a fascinating film, and again, hugely dreamlike and quite compelling to watch. Slow moving, but very compelling to watch. As this unfolds, you're left with this perennial question of what is real, what isn't in it.
Oh, yes, that sounds like a winning combination. You got your vampires, and that, is it real? Is it a dream? Is it a little of both? Those kind of movies, really, when you talk about suspending your disbelief, if you're already, like, in far enough that you're wondering whether the character is really experiencing this or the character is somehow suborning what's really happening into some fantasy. I mean, that they've got me. If I can just get that far, I know I'm in, and we are going to have an amusing David Lynchian almost time. And at least thus far, unless I'm missing any here, well, David Lynch will have to come up somewhere. As much as it's almost the foregone conclusion, but you got to be careful. He's the elephant in the room, and vampire stuff. The Doc, it's just. I don't know. I guess we all wonder what it would be like to live forever, and it's a vehicle for that. But then there's all this other mythology attached to it, and things that that there are no. Can you really go out in the sun? Sometimes. That there are a bunch of little provisos. How do you really kill a vampire? Can you really kill a vampire? Or is it always this very temporary thing that some knucklehead can come along and he like pulls the stake out or undoes a silver bullet somehow, and all of a sudden you've got, well, he's not alive, he's just undead again, right? Right. I guess that's how it works. Oh man, and just quickly, while it's in my head, having nothing to do almost with Doc, besides the fact that I am sure Doc loves a lot of Russ Myers and his one-man vision of large-breasted women being worshipped and fought over by crazy geezers. He did so many films that kind of, oh boy, there's a bunch there. And almost all of them are worth running past your eyeballs.
That's Jean Rollin. He didn't just make vampire films. He did a very interesting one with the title, I forget now. So pesticides, illegal pesticides being used at a vineyard, which eventually turns people into sort of crazy. It's superficially similar to George Romero's The Crazies, but plays out differently in the end. He also supposedly directed a notorious zombie picture, Lake of the Zombies, a film which Jess Franco was meant to direct, but even Jess Franco couldn't be bothered with it. And he ended up directing a very similar film called Oasis. I say similar, obviously no Lake Oasis instead. Oasis of the Zombies, but that's a different story entirely. Lake of the Zombies in reality was most of it was actually directed by Roland's assistant, because Roland himself thought it was bloody awful and he couldn't be bothered. Roland was interesting as well because his vampire films during his lifetime, although they built a cult following and are much admired now, never made any money. And he used to direct under another name. He used to direct porn films on the side, which were successful in order to finance these projects. Another name in continental quirky filmmaking one must mention is Paul Naschy. At least that's the name he acted under. He was actually called Jacinto Molina, an Italian bodybuilder, weightlifter, turned film auteur, the auteur of low-budget films. Although actually later in his career he made some more acclaimed sort of art house, almost art house pictures. But he's best remembered for his horror films. Now, he was fascinated. He grew up watching those Universal monster movies, and he wanted to create something similar, but in Spain. And he, back in the late 60s, he did a film called Mark of the Wolfman, which is essentially a Spanish version of one of those Universal Monster Rally pictures. It throws everything in as him is the title character, Valdemar Daninsky, who is cursed with lycanthropy. He ends up having to fight another werewolf in it. There's evil vampires trying to vampirize people and doing experiments on capturing Daninsky and doing experiments on him and whatever. Also, it's got everything in it. Great stuff. Sort of, we have a werewolf on werewolf fight, and then he has a fight with the vampires and before succumbing to that silver bullet fired by the woman who loves him. It's all there. It's great stuff. All takes place against sort of half derelict castles and abbeys and things. It packs a lot into 90 minutes. It's actually very good. There were a number of sequels, some better than others. Technically it's not the first sequel, it's the second sequel, whose title it turns up quite a lot. I'm trying to remember its title. It's something of the Wolfman or of the Werewolf. But it's quite terrible, the sort of sequel. A sequel, which turns up a lot because it's in the public domain, the English language version, and it is quite terrible. The director on it had a different director than the first one, and according to Paul Nashi, this guy was drunk most of the time. And I tell you, watching the film, I believe what he said. It could only be made by somebody under the influence. In fact, they had to edit in footage from Mark of the Wolfman, much of which didn't match up properly. You watch the colour of his shirt changes and things, and the scenery change, to try and pad the film out. Others were more successful. He has lots of images. The Valdemar Daninsky, the films aren't a series in the sense that one isn't a direct sequel to the other. They often take place in different time periods and different scenarios for Daninsky. The common thread, he's basically this doomed soul who is doomed to repeat this cycle of being cursed and having to be killed by someone who loves him with a silver bullet on, and this cycle repeats itself through various different scenarios in the films. I mean, there's Dr. Jekyll and the Werewolf, self-explanatory. There's Werewolf versus the Yeti, self-explanatory. In fact, that's the only one with a happy ending, if I remember rightly, where he's cured of the curse, if I remember rightly. Werewolf versus the Vampire Woman, which is actually not a bad one. That's pretty good. That takes quite a bit of Hammer films influence into it. Things like all those vampire Hammer, latter-day Hammer lesbian vampire films, with these evil lady vampires, it seems to take a lot of that on board. He did a lot of other films outside of that series. Horror Rises from the Grave, Vengeance of the Zombies, things like that. In these films, he often played multiple roles. Like in Horror Rises from the Tomb, he plays this evil medieval nobleman who's so evil his own twin brother has him executed, and it lops his head off and has the head buried separately from the body and whatever. And of course, he plays the evil nobleman who then puts a curse on the descendants of his twin brother, also played by Nashi. And then the narrative moves to the then present day of the 1970s, and we meet one of the descendants of said brother of Nashi, played by Nashi again. And you'll find this a lot. It's the same in Vengeance of the Zombies. He plays at least three characters, and that I remember. Again, he's this bizarrely blacked up and with a turban on, playing an Indian mystic, his evil brother, and he turns up in a dream sequence playing Satan. And the narratives are often quite bizarre and twisting. A lot of his films fall into the blood and boobs category of Euro horror filmmaking, where there's lots of both on display in them, with a lot of the blood being on the boobs, spattered all over them. For obviously that's some kind of erotic fantasy of some of the people involved in making them. But yeah, so Nashi was obsessed really with recreating those classic horror films of he'd seen in his youth, but filtered through a Spanish sort of continental perspective. And he throws everything into them. They're quite amazing. Everything, including the kitchen sink, gets thrown into them. There's one I've not yet managed to track down, because his films have become increasingly difficult to find in the UK. Thankfully, some of them are the English language versions are in the public domain. They turn up on free streaming channels and on YouTube quite a bit. But there's one of his most infamous, Hunchback of the Morgue, in which he plays the title character, which throws absolutely everything into it. Is one I've yet to be able to track down. But Vengeance of the Zombies I mentioned there. That's something that throws everything in. It has overtones of the Phantom of the Opera as zombies, but not George Romero type zombies. These are more your classic voodoo type zombies, and does indeed part of the plot involves voodoo rites and whatever, and the misuse of voodoo, and of course the traditional Scotland Yard investigation because it's set in the UK. But to be fair, there are quite a lot of sequences actually shot in the UK. Some of them actually with Nashi in them, not just establishing shots, which is relatively unusual at the time. There are other continental horror films and some giallos which were actually shot on location in the UK. Most notably Living Dead at the Manchester Morgue, also known as Don't Open the Window, and many other titles, was shot mainly in the UK on up in the Lake District and the Peak District. But another type of quirky film, to move away from specific directors, that I particularly enjoy are Spanish and Italian films that are supposedly set in the UK, but are in fact not. They're filmed on location in Italy or Spain, with only the shakiest grasp of what the UK really looks like. To give a couple of examples, the Italian UFO conspiracy thriller Eyes Behind the Stars, that again I talked about in my regular podcast a while ago. That was one of those films where I was partway through watching it, maybe 15 minutes in, and suddenly thought about, so this is meant to be set in England, isn't it? Because it's not apparent. To me, it looks like, hey, it's all being filmed in Italy, or the architecture is typically Italian. They managed to muster some English cars, some British cars, but only a couple of them are right-hand drive. Most are left-hand drive. And if we're to believe this film, people in the UK drive lots of American cars about. The number of sort of Ford Mustangs and sort of Buicks, whatever, that turn up in it. It really is bizarre, because they don't even use any establishing shots. They haven't had a second unit come to London. They haven't gone to a film library and got establishing shots like of London, where a lot of it's meant to be set. They get the RAF uniforms right in one sequence, but they get the ranks wrong. If I remember rightly, the senior RAF man is referred to as a general. There's no such rank in the Royal Air Force. be an air marshal, or vice air marshal, or an air chief marshal. Those are the general officer ranks in the RAF. It is bizarre. What makes it even more bizarre in the English language version is that it has one very well-known American actor in it, the character of Martin Balsam. And bizarrely, in the English language version, he's been dubbed by an actor with a North of England accent, Boyaklad and all that sort of thing. It's quite bizarre hearing this voice coming apparently from the mouth of Martin Balsam, who's such a sort of well-known, particularly in sort of cult movies and sort of low-budget movies, such an iconic American character actor. He was the private detective Arbogast in Psycho, for instance, one of his best-known roles. Very, very strange, but nothing in it looks English. It's just so bizarre. There's no the newsroom of the newspaper doesn't even look like a typical Fleet Street newsroom. It's quite clearly a continental newspaper. It's just so weird, and sense of dislocation for the English viewer, British viewer it gives. Very, very odd. Even odder is a film which, strictly speaking, doesn't have an English language title because there was never officially an English language version of ever released. However, a dubbed version, it's a Spanish-made film. Well, another Italian-Spanish co-production. There was eventually an English subtitled version released a few years ago under the title Tragic Ceremony. Now, its original Italian title was very cumbersome and would translate into English roughly as something like from the secret police files of a major European city or something like that. But it's another film. I came into it partway through once on a streaming channel. And again, I was watching it. There's all these people speaking Italian in it. And subtitles coming up. And it just occurred to me, this is meant to be set in England, isn't it? Again, a strange feeling. Because it's quite clearly filmed in Spain. There's a bizarre sequence with these policemen, and it took me a while to recognize they're meant to be English policemen. Ask the female lead, where she lives, and she tells them Chelsea. Chelsea's in West London, big city. Yet when these characters get to their supposed home in Chelsea, it appears to be a villa in the middle of nowhere. The whole thing is just weird. Now, to be fair, they do have lots of English cars in it. Unfortunately, they're all left-hand drive. They get it right at that time. A popular police car was the Rover P6, but please, ours were right-hand drive, not left-hand. And it's all off-kilter. Because it's clear, like the highway they're on, countryside they're in is clearly Spanish. It's clearly Spain. It's just so weird. You're left thinking, why did they set it in England? This could easily have been set anywhere else in Europe. Why England? It's very, very, very odd. And just all the details are completely bizarre. Like this filling, this petrol station, gas station, you call it in the States, that they pull into at one point, has hand-operated, hand-cranked pumps. And they don't think anything odd about this. I mean, God almighty, in the UK, I don't think it's, not since long before World War II, would you have found anywhere with hand-cranked pumps. They'd all gone over the 30s on, certainly at least the 30s onward, to electrically operated pumps. Avery Hardall, who was the firm famously used to manufacture, was the original manufacturer of most of the electric pumps you find in British filling stations. And in fact, the older Avery hard old pumps have all been replaced by more modern ones now, are very, very collectible. There you go. But these hand cranked ones, and they just don't think there's anything untoward about this. And it doesn't help that none of the characters look English. They look too healthy for one thing. This film was made in about 72. And trust me, in 1972, the average Brit didn't look that anywhere near. They don't these days. Don't look that healthy. They don't have sort of nice, obviously natural tans like that and gleaming white teeth, and they're not all handsome looking. There's nobody wandering around with a beer belly and a fag hanging out of their mouth. It's coughing all the time, nicotine stained fingers. I'm going by my childhood memories here. It's very, very odd. But, of course, the thing to remember is that these films weren't intended ever to be seen in the English-speaking world. They were made for primarily local audiences who had never been to England. They had no idea what, apart from the odd TV seen films, they had no real idea of what Britain was like, British culture was like, and so on. I mean, for that sort of thing as well, I could refer you to another Paul Naschy film. Was it Seven Murders for Scotland Yard? Where it has some establishing shots in London, but most of it's clearly filmed in Madrid, in and around Madrid. I mean, the interpretation of a British pub is bizarre. It's set in the 1970s. It's quite bizarre. Scotland Yard appears to be a small provincial police station. And everybody has, and it's true also in Tragic Ceremony, everybody has bizarre taste in wallpaper in England, they believe. Some truly odd wallpapers, particularly in people's offices. To found a wallpapered office, even in the 70s in this country, would be very difficult, apart from some very old sort of, solicitor's office. Police stations in particular, plain painted walls, whatever, all the better to wash the blood off of when they beat up suspects. And standard police interrogation method back then. Oh, it's all very odd. Very, very dislocating. But at least in neither film do we do the thing that you do find in many Spanish and Italian films. They'll give an establishing shot of Big Ben to tell us we're now in the UK, and for some reason you hear bagpipes playing over the top. This is failing to grasp. There's an essential difference between England and Scotland. Trust me, the sound of bagpipes in England just, will end up with whoever's playing them being strangled. Horrible cacophony. To be sure, as Sean Connery says in The Longest Day, to be sure, only an Irishman can play the pipes. And obviously, being of Irish descent, I quite agree. But I digress. Finally, on a final thought about quirky filmmaking. We don't necessarily have to look at exploitation films to find examples of quirky filmmaking. Perhaps the quirkiest film I can think of is a French film directed by Bertrand Blier. Quite a well-known French director, his era. Very well thought of. It's a film called Les Valseurs. It stars, as sort of well-known actors in it, Gérard Depardieu, Patrick Duet, and Miu Miu, who's a lovely actress. That was a professional name. And she took up acting, actually. I remember reading this. She took up acting to overcome her shyness. And obviously it worked. She took up acting classes. And it obviously worked because every bloody film I've ever seen her in, her clothes fall off at some point. She made a lot of films in the 70s and 80s in France. If you saw her name in the titles, you knew you were going to get some female nudity in it. And but Les Valseurs, getting back to the point, directed by Bertrand Blier. Now, the first clue that this isn't going to be a regular sort of movie that's going to be quirky is the title that has no direct translation into English. The closest you can get is it would translate into something like bollocks or the balls. But there's a reason for this. In the film, Depardieu and Dewey are a pair of small-time delinquents and crooks who obviously live in a small town and go on a small-town crime spree, which involves things like stealing somebody's combine harvester and joyriding with it through several fields, things like that. It's all small-town stuff. They then make the mistake of trying an armed robbery on a hairdresser's. Unfortunately for them, the owner of said hairdressers is actually the local small-time crime boss, who shoots at them as they're escaping. And one of the bullets grazes one of Dewey's testicles. See, we're getting to the title here. And he fears this has rendered him impotent because he can't get it up after that. And now the film switches its attention to his friend Depardieu, deciding he's on a mission now, not just to get revenge on the salon owner, but also to cure his friend's impotence, which he believes is merely psychological. Now, this involves, at one point, the salon owner's mistress is played by Miu Miu. She's one of the stylists there. And, Depardieu persuades her to allow him to have sex with her while Deo watches, in the idea that he can, Deo will be aroused by this. Anyway, it's a scene you have to see to believe. I can't really do it justice, but basically, she has a reputation for being frigid. Anyway, and Depardieu believes, not only can he arouse Deo, but that he's so manly, he can cure her of this sexual frigidity. And so she's lying there on the floor, whilst he narrates what he's doing to Deo, using driving analogies about, first of all, you start off slow in first gear, and the way the shot is composed most of the time is from tabletop level, and all you can see is Depardieu's naked arse bouncing up and down over the table at varying speeds according to which gear he's in. Now we go into top and his arse goes away really quickly. Whereas all the time they'll cut to a shot of Miu just lying there impassively, frankly bored with it all, and is completely unimpressed with his efforts. And of course it does nothing for his friend to arouse his friend in any way. So now, accompanied by Miu, the film just gets more reprehensible and bizarre after that. At one point, Depardieu pays a young girl who's in the same compartment as them on a train ride to allow Deo to fondle her breasts in the hope that might help Deo, which doesn't work. He hires a woman who's just come out from a long prison sentence and therefore hasn't had any to sleep with Deo. It's such, At one point he decides that maybe Deo has been turned gay by his experience, and perhaps the best way to get him going again is in a friendly way to give him one up the backside, up the keister, so to speak, which again is, you just left watching this film with every development. Your jaw dropping. I cannot believe this has been committed to film. And it's one of those films but in the end it just sort of ends. It never really comes to a proper conclusion. And it really is the best. I've tried to describe it as being like a buddy film, except it's not the sort of buddy film that would be remade in Hollywood with, I don't know, Tom Cruise and Eddie Murphy in it, say. It's just not that sort of film. It used to show up on late night on British television quite a lot, but it's vanished these days. Partly, I think, because Depardieu at the moment is subject to all sorts of allegations and charges, isn't it? So, we have to pretend he didn't exist. But again, it's about the essential amorality of the characters in French films. for want of anyone else, Depardieu and Dare are being presented to us as our heroes. You know, they're petty crooks and delinquents. Yet they're the closest thing to good guys we found. And their behaviour, particularly Depardieu, is quite reprehensible. And it's just an astounding film to watch unfold. Les Valseurs, you ever get the chance to watch that, you should do so. You will be left astonished. So I can't do it justice with my description. It is utterly astonishing to watch. There's a guy I worked with once. I saw it was on the schedules over the weekend. I've been talking about films, and I said to him, seriously, I said, you should watch this film. I said, I won't describe anything that's in it, but you will end up, well, in fact, even before the end, you'll be saying, what the, And on the Monday, we were back in the office. He says to me, I watched that film. I said, bloody hell, you were right. What the hell was that? That is, for want of a better word, one of the quirkiest films I've ever seen. And on that note, I shall say, back to you, PQ.
Oh yeah, the sensibilities of the French, that they reach out a little farther than the average American I know, and I would imagine even those European sex comedies, all of them are just, you're watching them, and then there's always something that makes my jaw just drop. And it's usually some social convention that just isn't very American. When I'm and while we're on things that you're in life, we have watched. If we're just going to talk about the unexpected, I don't know. I must have been in my late teens, and I'm watching. Back then you just flipped around the channels and something caught your eye, and you sat there and you watched it. It was much more random on that level, and you also had less choices. I mean, I think I had cable, but back then basic cable meant you got all the channels you might get with an antenna, but clear. I mean, if you wanted to get all those, Discovery channels and Nickelodeon, it would be a next step up. And then, of course, you could get HBO and Cinemax. But I'm digressing. Here I am, just flipping around the channels, and there's a black and white movie, and I would always stop for black and white content, because there was something mysterious. And I grew up, at a certain point, it was just that's what was on. But even when I finally got color TV of my very own, the black and white, especially if it was like a slightly cruddy stock black and white footage, I thought, what do we have here? And I am watching this movie about this guy, and he's growing this plant, and it turned out to be Little Shop of Horrors, but I had no idea what it was. I mean, I probably came in 10 minutes in, 15 minutes in, and I'm watching this movie, thinking, I think at first I thought this was an attempt at being a serious, and then what a crazy movie. And still a classic, and other people will swear by that Rick Moranis musical version, and I can't watch that. I really can't. It's just too, everything about musicals that I can just, I don't know. I don't even give it a fair chance. I'll be the first to admit it. Once it's that, oh boy, yeah, I can just pass. I'll pass. I'm a bad person. Yep, I'll accept that. Oh, and just the idea of Gerard Depardieu's cheeks bouncing up and down. It sounds great. And there was this, speaking of weird location shifts, there was this series, I didn't know it was remade until I did a little research. In 2010, they tried to relaunch it. Jerry Cotton, who was a G-man, that's an American, I guess, FBI agent, And a man by the name of George Nader starred in, I believe, 4 or 5 of these movies in the 1960s in Germany, and they were made in German, of course. And to make it look like it was shot in America, I suspect they sent a second unit crew out to America, like New York, and shot a bunch of really cool period footage of Manhattan and New York. But everything else is so obviously not in New York, and there are even a couple of attempts, I think, at rear projection that kind of make the whole thing jump out at you. But it's a fun series if you want to talk about quirky movies. They're just